Holy City Center Radio is episode 182, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Friday, October 13th, 2023. Yes, it is Friday the 13th, and in October, no less. Is there a scarier, more perfect time for there to be a Friday the 13th? No, of course not. Right in the spookiest month of the spookiest season we have. Happy Friday the 13th. Hope it's the fun kind of spooky for you, and I hope you have an amazing weekend, and you know exactly where to go if you need some plans. Go to holycitycenter.com/events, and you can see what is going on in town this weekend and beyond as we get closer and closer to Halloween and all the parties and celebrations there will be. That is the place to find all that info. Speaking of the season, I have decided to, do what I'm sure everyone is doing and watch spooky movies and television shows. So I started out my movie and TV spooky binge by rewatching the original Scream from 1996. I don't think I've seen it since probably around that year, maybe once or twice after, but it's been a long, long time. And let me tell you, I have a new appreciation, not just for that film, but for the franchise as a whole, because I've gone on to watch, the sequels and everything. Especially when you put it in context of the time for those who were alive during that time frame, 1996, and were old enough to watch the movie. Kind of brought horror films back. I know that they were still happening, but when you think of classic horror films, most of them are from like the 70s. You think of like Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, Nightmare Before Elm Street. I know they trickled into the 80s a little bit, but it just feels like that was my generation's horror franchise, the classic one. We didn't really, have one, of course, until then. It was just sequels to some of the ones I mentioned, and he came back with a vengeance. And what made it cool, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, was that there was a little bit of humor to it. Like, I kind of remembered that from when I saw it, but I was just so nervous and afraid back then and didn't want to be scared that I don't think I appreciate it. But also just like the meta commentary, which I vaguely remembered as well, where it's like they're discussing horror movie cliches and tropes while obviously this is a horror movie. So they just did a really great job of like humor and making it funny and meta while also still being its own horror film. So I don't know. I just have a new appreciation for it, and it just holds up, and the stars from that movie and some of the choices they made, especially that first scene. Spoiler alert for someone who hasn't seen 1996's Scream. Drew Barrymore was in like the promo. She's on the poster, the trailers that were out there. And you thought, oh, Drew Barrymore, she is deep in this film. She's a big name. And she's killed off in the first 10 minutes, that first scene. That was epic back then. That sort of stuff didn't really happen. You didn't attach a big star to a project and then kill them off right away. So that, it just let you realize that, hey, really anything could happen in this franchise, where at the time, just a single movie, of course, but it became a franchise. Anyway, I've been enjoying watching them. Even the new ones are not bad. They did a good job of, tipping their cap to the older movies, bringing back some legacy characters but still having that meta-ness and talking about sequels and what they called requels. And I've just been enjoying it. It's a lot of fun, but not sure what I'm going to move on to when I finish the Scream run. There's I think it's six total movies are in the Scream franchise. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. If I'm going to go for another horror franchise or like some one-off movies, we'll see. Maybe dig into some of the classics. I don't think I've really ever seen any of the Hitchcock films, for instance. So we'll see what we get into as we continue here into October. But, on Friday the 13th, I probably have to watch a Friday the 13th film, right? I mean, it just makes sense. Are you guys doing the same? I know some of my friends are. What have you been watching? Give me some recommendations. You can send them to me on social media or wherever you know how to contact me. Outside of that, I did have a pretty momentous occasion for myself as it relates to Holy City Center. I've been able to do a lot of fun things because of this website, whether it's interviewing certain people, meeting certain people, getting invites to things. you just never know the kind of crazy things that'll happen from, having your own little website. And one of the bigger moments, I was approved for a media pass to an event involving the Vice President of the United States. Did not see that coming with my blog when I started it, that's for sure. Now, this wasn't an interview. I didn't have any one-on-one time with Vice President Kamala Harris, but was able to get into an event that I wouldn't have otherwise because I was considered media for it. That event was at the College of Charleston, and that was on Wednesday. Part of her Fight for Our Freedoms tour. She's going around to different colleges. Nothing surprising. It's essentially just outreach to the younger voting bloc, talking points about different things going on that the administration believes are important to that age group. So this event was only open to college students, but again, because of the media aspect, they did allow media in, and I lucked into it, which is pretty great. The event itself, again, pretty standard stuff. It was exciting for me this is the first time I've been in a room covering an event in any capacity for someone this high up. I've spoken to Mayor Tecklenburg before. I have spoken to musicians, and recently comedian Paul F. Tompkins. Some really cool things, but this is the highest up as far as politics for sure. Again, not a one-on-one conversation, but still just neat to be in the room, politics aside. And so the event, taking that out of it, was pretty uneventful, for lack of a better term. Not that it was bad or anything, but there was no major announcements. Everything that she talked about, whether it was LGBTQ rights, talking about book bans, voting rights, abortion, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that you've heard from this administration before. There was nothing groundbreaking, nothing surprising, but it was neat to be in the room, like I said, and I'm sure some of the students felt the same way. That were able to get in, because it was sold out, even though it was free to register. But there's about 700-ish seats in there, and it was filled. And that doesn't count the plethora of Secret Service agents and police and everything else, that were dispersed around the venue. But without getting into too many details, when I arrived, the media arrival place, the door was closed and there was a bunch of people in the way because the students had lined up to get into the venue. And so there was a line in front of where the media entrance was. So I had a contact. I called them. It became a whole thing. I was like, "Hey, part of the media. I'm here, but I can't go to the door that was designated for our arrival. Where should I go?" The person on the end said, "Well, I just spoke to Secret Service. They're not letting anybody in right now," which is just a weird thing to hear when you're on the phone with someone. So I'm like, "All right, so his person's got to call me back." Eventually, obviously, they cleared it. They started letting people in, and it was time for me to go in. But they wanted me to show them like a press badge. Well, I don't have a press badge. I don't work for, like, say, the Associated Press or CNN or a local news station where I have a badge, to like get into the office. It doesn't work that way. This is my own thing. So I don't have like a parent company that is well known that provides me with a badge. So I explained that to them, like, "Well, do you just have your regular ID on you?" Yes. They take a look at my ID, and the Secret Service guy's looking at the media liaison, and he's like, "Hey, look, basically," he didn't say this, but it was like, "This is a real ID. We've got his information. It's up to you if you want to let him in without a media credential." And obviously they let me in, and there's a bunch of stuff I had to do after, typical, metal detectors, and they had to look at anything I brought with me. I had to like turn my laptop on to prove that it was actually a laptop, and, stuff like that. So it's not like they just let me in willy nilly with no background check or, looking in at all to what I was walking in there with. But I was just waiting, and it didn't happen. I was just waiting for them to be like, "And what media outlet are you with?" And I was envisioning myself looking at this, media liaison from DC who works with the White House and Secret Service, and being like, "It's a holy city, sinner. Yeah, holy city." And having them be like, "What? Wait, I'm sorry. It's what?" Like, "So you have some site with sinner in the title, and you think you can just come to an event that involves the Vice President of the United States?" Thankfully, they did not ask me what media outlet what I was with, so I didn't have to go through that odd moment. I've had those moments with, smaller events where it's like a national event that is here, and I get some funny looks like, I'm sorry, your website is what now? Obviously when I'm dealing with locals, especially PR firms or event venues that are familiar because I post about their events and things, not a big deal. Like, oh yeah, okay, sure, of course. But anytime someone's from out of town, it's always like weird to tell them the name of the website. Thankfully, I did not have to go through that. I got into the event and was able to cover it as part of the media. So just a funny little side story there that I had to deal with, and just how much security involves these politicians when they visit. But yeah, thankfully, I didn't have to go through the embarrassment of trying to explain, like, no, I know it's a funny name, but I'm not here to cause any trouble, all that good stuff. So that's what's going on here. But let's dive into the latest news. All right, we have just a quick update, I promise, involving the Charleston County School District Board of Trustees. If you need a recap, go back to the last couple episodes. I talk about it a lot. Here's the latest update, though. There was a special called Charleston County School District School Board meeting. These are special called meetings, or when there isn't one on the books. And these are the meetings that have been called into question because they have been breaking state law, according to our Attorney General, as well as these executive sessions that have been out of public eye. So it appears the Moms for Liberty faction of the board, after being told that they have been breaking state law, they decided they needed to do a better job to make sure that the decisions that they've made that have been wildly unpopular are legitimate. So they had a special called meeting. It was held on Thursday morning. There was no executive session. It was all discussions were done in public, and the end result was basically what you assumed was going to happen. They just, all these unpopular decisions, they just made it so that decisions went through again, but through the proper channels so that no one could question them and say, hey, since you suspended or put on a paid leave the superintendent during an illegal meeting, according to state law, that decision's null and void. So they were just trying to make it official so that their terrible decision was now legal and they could just rest their hats on that. So ultimately the meeting ended with two decisions. One, and both votes were 5-4. The Moms for Liberty faction voting in lockstep with each other. The first one was a motion to authorize the board chair to consult with legal counsel and Dr. Eric Gallien's legal counsel to select a firm for the investigation of allegations involving the superintendent. The second, same vote again. The motion was in place for the superintendent to be put on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. So again, he's still on administrative leave. They just did this properly in terms of state law, even though people still think the decision is wrong. But now they can, sit back and not have to answer questions still or anything, anything involving transparency. They just made sure that the decisions that could be called into question, they can now say, oh, no, we did everything properly this time. So sorry, these things are in place. But it seems they may have made a tiny little mistake that State Representative Marvin Pendarvis called out shortly after the meeting ended. They did not vote in this meeting to assign an interim or temporary superintendent, someone to fill in for Dr. Gallien during this paid administrative leave. Now, they did make that decision at the illegal meeting, where they put someone, basically in charge until the investigation is over. But they did not do that in this meeting. So if this meeting was to make up for the fact that the last one could be called into question for being illegal and then making all votes null and void, at this point, they don't have an interim person. Again, just based on state law and the fact that they got reprimanded for it, they forgot to do that. So at this time, technically, there is no one who is taking the superintendent duties, again, not legally anyway. The person they assigned as the interim person is probably still doing the work, but technically they're doing it for no reason because they didn't revote it. So still a mess. still making mistakes. And even though they, tried to do things better and more importantly, according to state law, they still forgot one of their dumb moves. Just unbelievable. Just such a mess. And even when they've tried to right a wrong, they still go forward with terrible decisions, and they forget to vote on all their terrible decisions. So just comically sad at this point, I think, is the best way to describe it. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court is signaling something that's going to be somewhat surprising, I think. The U.S. Supreme Court on Wednesday seemed likely to preserve the Republican hold on a South Carolina congressional district against the claim that it treats black voters unfairly. This outcome could shape the fight for control of the House of Representatives, as it is a very narrow margin of a lead that the Republicans currently have as far as seats. There's been a few districts in different states that have been overturned as far as they've been ruled that they were gerrymandered. And as you all know, there's one in South Carolina, the 1st district, that has been called into question. But for some reason, the court seems to be signaling that they are going to let this district redistricting that was in place at the last election stay in place. The court's 6 conservative justices kind of signaled some skepticism with the lower court ruling that was in, South Carolina, that ordered the state redraw a coastal district that is currently held by Republican Nancy Mace. When Mace first won election back in 2020, she barely beat the Democratic incumbent, that of course was Representative Joe Cunningham. She won by just 1% of the vote. It was about 5,400 total votes was the difference. So very, very close margin. 2 years later, following that redistricting, that was allegedly driven by the 2020 census results, Mace ended up winning re-election by 14%. So she goes from barely winning 1% of the vote to having 14%, not 1% of the vote, I'm sorry, having a 1% advantage as far as the vote total to 14%. Now, that could be for any number of reasons, obviously, but it was somewhat surprising to a lot of us that it was that much of an advantage, considering, stuff that we had seen. Like, really didn't think Nancy Mace was that popular after her first term, and was somewhat surprising to see that, her margin of victory was that big. But again, maybe there's something else behind that. Who knows? But then when you looked at the fact that it was there was redistricting done, and then people called into question that redistricting, and then a court in South Carolina said, yeah, this is gerrymandered along racial lines. It started to make a little bit more sense. For some reason, the Supreme Court doesn't seem to agree, and it's baffling. So this redistricting that took place for the 2022 election, it moved 30,000 black residents of Charleston out of Mace's district. When you start hearing stuff like that, that signals to you there's something amiss here. So 30,000 black residents were moved out of Mace's district. I don't know how you can argue that is not racially gerrymandered, but we'll get into that here in a moment. The state argued that partisan politics, not race, and a population boom in the coastal areas explain the congressional map. So the state, which is obviously, in this case, the Republicans who drew this map, although as we've talked about in the past, Jim Clyburn may have kind of signed off on it because it helped him out in his district, but he would have won his district even without redistricting. So it seems like, why would he even be involved? But that's a story for another day. So the lawyer for the state, his name is John Gore, he basically said the General Assembly had no reason to and did not use a racial target. It used political data to pursue its political goals, which also sounds like gerrymandering and should not be allowed. If you have political data and you're pursuing political goals, that's basically saying, yeah, we gerrymandered it so we would have a better opportunity. That's not how it's supposed to work. And that should be like, well, wait, you basically just admitted it's gerrymandered. You just aren't admitting that it's gerrymandered along racial lines. That shouldn't be how it is. But in any event, the lower court here in South Carolina concluded that the state used race as a proxy for partisan affiliation in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, one of the three liberals on the U.S. Supreme Court, sounded sympathetic to the challengers, and she noted that the old and new districts kept the Democratic-leaning Black voting age population at 17%, which is low enough to keep electing a Republican representative. She said, quote, "How do you explain the consistency? I mean, my understanding is that thousands of people were moved in and out of this district, and yet that line, the line concerning the amount of, Black voters, adult voter participation remained the same," end quote. So she makes a good point. With all these changes, how did that percentage just happen to stay exactly the same? Really interesting. Meanwhile, Brett, I like beer, Kavanaugh, and Justice John Roberts split with the other conservatives previously and joined the liberal justices when the Supreme Court in June said that Alabama had diluted Black voters' political power. So that's why this was a little surprising. Despite this majority that the Republicans have in the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh and Roberts did split with their conservative counterparts and did say, yeah, Alabama definitely diluted Black voters' political power. There's other cases where it seems to be that they're signaling that there's been some gerrymandering. So why is this district in South Carolina not being treated the same? It's really bizarre. And it makes you wonder what's going on here, because why is this different than the Alabama case or some of the others that they're discussing? It's really bizarre and disheartening to see and feel like, hey, they're going to rule that this district is okay, and then it's going to make it even harder to get Nancy, I'm a serious politician who definitely doesn't do performative politics, Mace out of office. Yeah, it's really disappointing to say the least. Some quick updates involving aviation disasters here in the Charleston area. First, Charleston County is getting ready to purchase a replacement for the sheriff's office helicopter that crashed back in August 1st at the Charleston International Airport. The pilot, if you remember, was injured in that crash, but is okay and is recovered. The helicopter was destroyed after it fell from about 20 feet in the air when it was like twisting around, and then the nose of it slammed into the grass just off of a runway, and it also resulted in the tail snapping off. A preliminary investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board found that the helicopter was missing parts that could have rendered the pilot unable to steer it as he flew it back home from routine maintenance in Sumter. The sheriff's office is requesting up to $7 million to cover the cost of the new helicopter and other specialized equipment that is needed to upfit it for law enforcement use. So helicopter, when you just buy it, there's certain things that police departments want added to it, for their official use. That exact cost is unknown, according to Charleston County spokeswoman Kelsey Barlow. Despite that, the request had no problems getting through the county council's finance committee, which met October 5th. And there was really no discussion on the purchase. It was just like, yep, let's do this. So now the request is on the county's consent agenda, which was October 10th, when, again, it was expected to pass with no resistance. And that is exactly what happened. The county expects to borrow the funds next spring, according to Barlow, but the total will be reduced by any proceeds from disposing of the old helicopter and any insurance claim payouts, which county officials say could take more than a year. Barlow also said that the county doesn't yet know how much it will get back from insurance, so that price tag may come down from that $7 million based on, again, any proceeds they get from disposing the old helicopter and whatever money they get from an insurance payout. The second story about aviation issues involves that fighter jet that recently crashed. The cleanup of the rural farmland and swamp where that $90 million unpiloted Marine Corps fighter jet crashed has been completed. However, the investigation into what caused the pilot to eject and then led to the crash is continuing. The cleanup was designed to remove any evidence of the September 17th accident so the land can continue to grow naturally. This is according to the Navy, who put that statement out in an October 11th press release. To accomplish this, the Navy and Marine Corps had to remove affected crops, underbrush, trees. They had to test the soil and things like that. Now, you may remember that F-35 jet incident occurred during a rainstorm in which the unidentified pilot ejected, landing in a North Charleston neighborhood. They were sent to a medical facility but were released pretty quickly. Minor injuries. They are doing well, which is great. And thankfully, despite the fact that the plane continued flying before ultimately crashing about 60 miles away in Williamsburg County, no one was injured on the ground. So what could have been an unthinkable disaster, thankfully turned out with minor injuries to the pilot only. According to officials, there is no expected long-term effects to the crash site. Everything there should be fine and should be growing as normal. As I mentioned, the crash is still being investigated, and officials said they will stay in contact with people who live in that vicinity just to make sure, if something does come up, they are made aware of it. As far as the investigation, additional details about progress on that or what has been found were not shared, which has been in line pretty much since the day of the crash, where details coming out of Joint Base Charleston or from any branch involved with the crash, details have been very hard to come by. It's been very quiet and hush-hush about much of what occurred. So no new details as far as that's concerned. And lastly, some sad news to pass along. Mark Cummins, who was a longtime restaurateur who brought restaurants like T-Bones, Pearl's Oyster Bar, and Kaminsky's Dessert Cafe to Charleston, died back on October 5th. He was 66 years old. His death comes just 1 year to the day after getting a chest x-ray that led to his October 2022 sarcoma diagnosis. So some sad news that someone who was a pillar in the community has passed. I did not have the pleasure of meeting Mark, but everything I've read, whether it was official news stories or people's posts on social media, seemed to show that he was a beloved figure in this community. He was well respected and will certainly be missed. So, for sure, some sad news, and my thoughts and prayers are with his family and friends as they go through this difficult time. Again, just despite not having met him, I could see from this outpouring of love and support just how well respected he was in this community. And that will do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Thank you so much for listening. If you have a moment, please subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any episodes. And if you have a chance as well, like, review, give us a star rating, whatever it is that you can do on the streaming platform you're currently listening to the show on, please do so. It really helps out. You can also help Holy City Center by going to holycitycenter.com/shop to pick up some merchandise, or patreon.com/holycitycenter, where you can sign up for one of the support tiers. I want to thank Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Sound System for producing each and every episode of this podcast, and also Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in every episode as well. Stay safe and have fun this weekend. Don't forget, if you need plans, go to holycitycenter.com/events to see what is going on all around town. Enjoy your weekend. I will speak to you again on Monday, but until then, good night and good luck.
When I was young and moving fast, nothing slowed me down.